I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Norsk, and welcome to Context is King, Best Practices for AI and Live Video. We're going to spend the next hour or so looking at how to architect for AI in real production use cases, not just flashy demos for a trade show booth. We'll start off with Norsk CEO Adrian Rowe talking about why context is crucial to successful AI implementation. And then he'll hand things over to Norsk Chief Development Officer and wannabe developer Dom Robinson, who's going to demonstrate some production workflows he's built using AI. We'll return to Adrian for a deeper look at how to effectively use LLMs, MCPs, and agentic AI in broadcast-grade environments. And then CaptionHub CEO Tom Bridges will discuss its real-time language localization suite Timbra and how it integrates into live production pipelines, including those you can build with Norsk. Before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping notes. The chat is open, but if you have questions for our speakers, please enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you're not seeing the Q&A tab, if you click on the three dots where it says More, you should be able to add the Q&A tab to the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote questions, so in the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar, we'll pose the most popular questions to our speakers. If you could do me a favor, and please don't try to answer other attendees' questions by typing your answers. Once you do that, that will move the question to the answered panel. We won't be able to see it anymore, and it just makes it that much more challenging. If we don't get to your questions during the allotted time, I will pass those questions along to our speakers after the webinar, and they will do their best to get back to you. Also, closed captioning is turned on by default. If you want to turn it off, you should be able to do so using the subtitles button at the bottom of your screen. Again, if you're not seeing it, click that More button with the three dots over it, and you should be able to see subtitles and turn them on or off. With that, I will pass things over to Adrian Rowe to kick things off. Adrian?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Eric, and thank you all for attending. Excited to be here. So let me share my screen, and hopefully Eric or somebody shout if that's not up,
Yep,
but it looks
we got
like
you.
we're there. So we've been experimenting with AI in live media for a good kind of 18 months now. And the core learning I think we've taken away from this is to do it really effectively is all about context. And if you get context right, very good things happen. And if you get context wrong, bad things happen. And that's kind of true in real life as well. And this is an old Punch cartoon that I rather like, that for me highlights how a small shift in context can have a huge shift in meaning and interpretation, because the punchline for this particular cartoon was George always did hate flowers. Yeah. So if you see something, LLMs and AI in general are great at taking information you hand to it and running with it despite not knowing whether they should. And in order to effectively allow those LLMs to do the job you really want them to, you've got to narrow down, you've got to give them guardrails, you've got to sort of, stop them from shooting themselves in the foot, because they're very want to do that. So tiny little bit about Norsk, first of all. So Norsk is the product that Ideas, the company, produces. We deliver, it's all around live. It's a combination of live linear channels and also live events. And we do lots and lots of them, well over 100,000 live events a year go through our tech. And our kind of key focus is all about being good on a bad day. It's how well you operate when, a cloud provider's region has disappeared for the day, and, do your live events still get out? Those are the kinds of things that we think are important, not quite so much how you operate in the lab. And I've worked in retail and in banking and various other technologies. Media technology is by far the most complex of those. Banking, in comparison, is probably the easiest. And media is full, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of specs and formats and details that need to be correct in order to make a media workflow work. And one of the things that we've always done is to try and make sure that we get the computer to do the detail. As far as humanly possible, we want the computer to look after the detail so we can think about the bigger picture. And in particular, we use some appropriate technologies for that, so that, for example, we use languages like PureScript, where you have to sort of provide almost a mathematical proof that the way you're constructing the software is going to be effective. And we use things like Erlang for delivering really, really high availability. But why that's important is that detail gets your media quality assessment and so on. It's one of my favorites, and I think we ought to go into it and look at it pretty closely. Except no, standards. Our view of it is standards are necessary, but they're dull. And yes, Norsk supports all sorts of things. Consistent segmentation, multi-availability failover, auto-scaling, transport streams, SRT, 2110, all this kind of stuff. But actually, the context, that's not really what matters. What matters is, here's the business process, here's the live workflow I want to focus on, and let the computers do what they're good at, which is all of that technical detail. So don't describe, demonstrate. I'm going to just create a couple of very simple workflows, and then we'll look at why that starts to be important and how that interacts with AIs in a meaningful way. So here's Norsk Studio. Norsk Studio takes the view that why is it really easy to describe a live workflow to another human being, but often really difficult to describe it to a computer. So our view is that actually media workflows are inputs, outputs, and stuff I might want to do in between. So there's all sorts of stuff I might want to do in between. I might want to use something like CaptionHub to add subtitles. I might want to publish in various different formats and so on. And so let's say I want an SRT input, and there's lots of detail that you can set. I'm just going to run with the defaults for now. I'm going to republish that as WebRTC. So here we go. There's a WebRTC publication. There's an SRT ingest. I'm going to just join those two because I want whatever media flows in to there to then disappear out the other side. And I'm going to say, go ahead, and if I fire up a source, ta-da, we have some SRT arriving, and we have that being redisplayed for us as WebRTC. Now, actually, there's an enormous amount of context, an enormous amount of detail under the covers in order to make that work, because those of you unfortunate enough to know the details of those two formats will actually probably understand that this is a perfect case of a square peg in a round hole, because WebRTC only supports one audio codec, and that's Opus, and I can't even put Opus into an SRT, a transport stream container. And so you've got some accidental complexity here, which is one of the reasons why media systems often get kind of very bloated and complex and difficult to maintain and evolve. And that makes life hard for human beings. It also makes life hard for AIs. It means suddenly there's a lot of detail that they're often having to process and manipulate. And you can get to that detail. So here's the SRT. Here's a real-time view of what's going on in that particular workflow. Excuse me. If you click on the how did you make the magic work here, you'll see that we had to inject a transcoder from the AAC that we received in order to turn that into Opus. And we had to reformat the video in a subtle way. What matters is this. This is my intent. The detail behind that's frankly necessary but uninteresting. And that's kind of the view we tend to take on most of this technology. And you can then start to get a little bit more sophisticated. I can say, let's do something like publish as an ABR ladder and publish as low latency HLS and dash with a on-screen graphic, for example. So again, if I kick off that source. Not only do we want to be able to see what's going on, obviously we need to programmatic control over what's happening as well. And what we want to do is make that programmatic control as straightforward as possible. So if I click here on the help, it says, well, you can have docs for everything, of which there are, I don't know, we must be getting on for 100 components that Studio supports now. But you can also just say, give me the docs that matter. And that's actually really important. So here, for example, we've got the ABR ladder, we've got our HLS and dash publication, we've got the on-screen graphic, and so on. And I can say to the on-screen graphic, oh, what can you do? You can tell me what the current graphic is. And the current graphic is the Norsk logo in the top left. And maybe I want to change that. Let's have the Norsk logo at position 100 by 200. And if I say, go ahead and do that, and there it is. That Norsk logo has now moved over to where I told it to. And what Norsk is allowing me to do is it's allowing me to build templates of my desired behavior And it's also then at giving me straightforward programmatic control on top of that. And you can build more and more and more complex things. So, up to something like Decision Director, where we're taking in multiple cameras, we're switching between them, we're adding a graphic, we're doing an HTML overlay on top. I just run this for a couple of seconds and publishing that in multiple formats. So, here you can see that we've got the various cameras, we can switch between them. You can see the lower third's been added there as part of the tickers and so on. And what you've got is a very straightforward description of a really quite complex thing. And each of these sort of sits there and lives on its own in isolation with very simple input and output requirements. And you can compose those together to build extremely complex live workflows. It turns out, we did that in order to make Norsk Studio as straightforward as possible for humans to use. Turns out that same approach actually is extremely helpful for how Norsk Studio interoperates with as well, because each of those components, rather than having to think about tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of lines of code, your AIs can instead think about far smaller units of work. I need an input. What are my available options? I need to transform that in order to get it into this publication. Well, it doesn't need to think about the detail of that. Norsk will take care of that detail for you. So at its heart, we have simplicity in how you create and control workflows. You've got really good observability, and we're removing accidental complexity. We're saying, actually, you only need to think about what it is that actually matters. And that has a big, big impact on making sure you don't misinterpret what's going on, and you can construct workflows, and you'll see in a second, back offices for those workflows in a very straightforward way. So the approach we took, is to use the right tools to make the development experience great for developers. We want that ability to describe and manipulate workflows to be great for humans. And we also, turns out, means that that's great for AIs to be able to think about, because it enables them to minimize the context and maximize the value that they give that. And as perhaps the most perfect example of where one has to necessarily minimize context in order to build complex solutions, I'm at this point going to hand over to my lovely colleague, Dom, because he embodies that requirement in great strides.
Excellent. Okay, well, look, I'm not going to spend a long time introducing myself, because that's not what we're here to talk about today, but long history in webcasting and streaming and so on. And I used to think of myself as quite technical, but then I teamed up with Adrian and Stephen, learnt my place. But a lot of my job is still to sit down with partners and customers to understand what they're trying to do and explore Norsk approaches to help that journey. What I'm going to do today, if I just get my screen share up and running, I'm just going to run some clips from some videos to show some of the experiments that I've been sort of playing with Norsk. So I use the word tinkering loosely, because some of these came together in a couple of hours, and I think that's either impressive or probably mildly alarming, depending on your relationship with traditional development timelines. So the next few minutes are about what happens when you take Norsk's native API architecture and point a large language model at it. Specifically, I've been using Norsk with Cursor, Claude, and Gemini, though the principle applies to whatever AI you happen to be arguing with this week. So let me show you what that looks like in practice. So we start with a fairly standard Norsk vision switcher. Adrian just introduced you to the concept of Norsk. A multi-view of 4 cameras. I'm running 3 in the demo. There's a source switch component running. We've got Singular Live for browser-based overlays coming in, and some on-stream titling. And I'm doing a single run fixed ladder encode, since this is running on a relatively old dev server in my office. So nothing too exotic, nothing you wouldn't recognize as a workflow that you might want to run in Norsk. Of course, every Norsk workflow generates its own specific API automatically. So every input, every component, every output, all of it's fully introspectable, fully controllable. It's one of those things that sounds like it should be obvious, but it isn't. It's not an intuitive thing to find in most products. And this is, I think, a feature of Norsk. So here's what's worth paying attention to. Every Norsk workflow generates its own specific API, every input, every component. And so we took that API and fed it into, in this case, Claude. And within a couple of hours, we had a functional dashboard, a working vision mixer running in the cloud, built by the AI and controlled through the web page, just using those same API calls. So no bespoke middleware, just the system as it stands. But what does that dashboard look like in practice? 4 channels, click a source, you're on that camera, control your graphics, manage overlays, all from a browser, all from anywhere. A couple of hours to build that using an AI. Awesome. That got me hooked at the beginning of the year. So we started playing with some MCR control room features, and Norsk deeply exposes what's happening inside a workflow. Every logs relevant state, every transition, every signal, every overlay. It's all structured data and it's all available in real time. And that gives the AI model something to actually work with. It's rich, meaningful, well-organized information, not the kind of stuff you might have historically had to deal with. So in this MCR-focused example, I used that to build a control room dashboard that lets you operate the system, turning graphics on, turning the overlays on and off, and I was seeing how that was affecting the encoder delays and so on. So you can chart and represent what you need in the control room, and the control room's no longer guessing. But take that an extra step, and it becomes interesting for people running real-world broadcast operations, because in a master control room environment, you can't watch every feed simultaneously. You manage by exception. Something goes wrong, you need to know quickly, and ideally without someone having to stare at a monitor bank for 6 hours. What we demonstrated was AI monitoring a video feed and identifying content. The workflow switches between some fencing footage and some drone flying footage. Gemini is watching the output in this case and correctly identifies which is on screen at any given moment, so you can see the monitor at the bottom. The clarification is straightforward. You're expecting fencing coverage, you get drone footage instead. That's a fault condition. The AI flags that it's red, it's immediate, it's unmistakable. But when the content returns, the alert clears within a few seconds. No manual acknowledgement, no lingering false positive. Model adapts because it's understanding what it's seeing, not just matching against a static rule. For an operator managing dozens of feeds, that's really genuinely useful. It's not revolutionary, it's just useful. Built in hours, it's on top of infrastructure that is already there. So then wants to explore making that actually monetizable and something practically valuable. So we use Gemini to make real-time decisions about when to play an advert, not time code triggered, not rule-based, actually watching the content and making a judgment call. The workflow had 2 sources, some live fencing footage and an ad loop from a file. Gemini monitored the live feed, and when a bout ended, a natural break in play, the model identified that as an appropriate moment for the ad break and acted on it autonomously. Ran the ad, then when it judged the time was right, I'll just fast forward through it a little bit here because the ad break went on for the duration of the break. But as they came back to the piece, it judged the time was right and it returned to life. So I'll be honest, it's a proof concept. I wouldn't put this in production tomorrow. I'm more testing it, the edge cases, but the point it makes is it's real. You're no longer entirely dependent on a producer hitting a button at precisely the right moment. It's watching, it's understanding content, and within the boundaries you define, it can act. And that's a meaningful shift in how live production workflows can be structured. So what outcomes through from all of that is fairly simple. Norsk's deep API architecture combined with modern AI tooling creates a genuinely different kind of development experience. Workflows we've shown, vision mixing, content monitoring, ad insertion, each would historically have required significant engineering effort. Custom integrations, weeks of work, development hours. That's the interesting bit, not that it's magic, but the barrier to building genuinely useful broadcast tooling has dropped considerably, and that opens up a lot of questions worth asking about what gets built next. Adrian, let me hand back to you.
Thank you very much. Right, let me do the thing that a magician shouldn't do and kind of reveal how some of that works under the cover, behind the covers. So let's that and back to slideshow, and away we go. So there are, I think, 3 categories of AI capability that I want to sort of focus on here. One is having an AI help me build the workflow in the first place. So I maybe I'm not a super technical expert in media. Maybe I want to create that workflow using natural language prompts, and maybe I want an AI to help me, with my encoding settings and things like that, so that the encoding is going to be appropriate for the type of content I'm about to send it. that's sort of step number one. I think part of the challenge there is even in a sort of Norsk Studio context, you're saving yourselves minutes or possibly hours. You're not saving yourself vast amounts of operational time. The next step in the road is actually that control interface and so on, a bit like Don was showing there, where I want a dashboard on top of it. And then finally, and in my opinion, most interestingly, how can I get AIs to help me actually with my production flow? How can I help them augment my production team or my MCR teams, so that I can start to perhaps monetize content that I otherwise couldn't do, and so on. We'll start to zoom in on that. So back to context is king. Our workflow descriptions are just YAMLs. Don't you just get the LLM to build you the YAML? The problem is, well, when this slide was written, it was about 70 components. I think we're closer to 100 now. And if you just say, dear LLM, here are the docs, you've probably blown about 50% of your context before you get to square one. And so what you want, the key thing is minimal context is king. I want the LLM to know as little as possible so that it can do its job. Anything I tell it that's above and beyond that starts to get unhelpful. I think golden rule number 2 is always get an AI to own homework. Even the best models, the Geminis and the Claudes and the GPTs of this world get it wrong. And the problem is they then very confidently go, oh, you asked for that, I've done that. Actually, if you get them to mark their own homework, or quite possibly get another, so you maybe build the workflow with Claude, but get Gemini to review it, you can actually get some really quite strong results as part of that. So just as is the case for a human being, we need to make sure that an LLM can find what it needs, but no more. And then as it needs to zoom in on the detail, we want to go from that, oh, actually, I want an input, that SRT is an option, RTMP is an option 2110, which is the right choice for my user. Oh, maybe it's SRT. I'm going to start to look at what are the details around that. How am I going to do passphrases, et cetera, et cetera. And you can go from a high level, minimal amount of information to the necessary detail that the LLM and the operator is going to have to provide. And then you go through a cycle where you say, here's my first stab at it. Let me mark my own homework. Is that actually going to be half useful for me? And so here's an example. This particular one was done with Gemini, but absolutely we support, we work day to day with basically all of the big AI providers. And all we said was, please make me a workflow that accepts a single SRT, builds me a 1080p encode ladder, and with 3 rungs, I think we've asked on that. Let me get that out of the way. It is 3 rungs, and outputs that to CMAF and gives me a preview on that. Now, in the interests of time, here are the basic steps. So here's Studio over on the left. Here's Gemini in this particular case, where we've told Gemini that there's an MCP server over here, and we've said exactly that same prompt. Make me a workflow that accepts a single SRT source and does that. Here's its ongoing work. The only reason I do that, it's terribly formatted. The browser overlay is in an error state. Try and understand what that is, why that is in a second. You'll also see that the encode ladder it's created here as its first step has got 1, 2, 3, 4 rungs, and we asked for 3. So at that point, it's going to start to mark its own homework. And it's, at that point it realizes actually the user asked for 3, I gave it 4, that's not so good. And so you'll see here now that the encode ladder's got the right number in, and it's added in the CMAF output, and it's added in the JPEG preview, but the browser overlay is still in an error state. And it's saying to me, oh, I've done as much as I can. I've created a 3-rung ladder. That's all looking good. But ultimately, I can't do a browser overlay without a URL to overlay. And so it came back here and said, hold on, please provide the exact URL that you want, because that's something that is specific to this particular event. I can't make that up out of thin air, or at least not in a useful way. And so I said, okay, let's use the singular endpoint. And at that point, away we go. There's our source coming in. We're adding browser overlay to it. We're encoding it as a 3-rung ladder, and we're publishing it. Really nice. We've gone from 0 to a working live workflow in a matter of a minute or two without any specialist skills, and doing some relatively sophisticated manipulation. So what happened? We did a whole bunch of searches to find out what we looked for in code and SRT and overlays and previews. We found some components. It started to look up what the capabilities of those components were. So it looked up a few. For the ones where it thought, oh yes, actually that's going to help, it then dug in on a bit more detail. It then started to wire those together. Does it make sense to have the SRT? It figured out itself that the browser overlay needs to live between the SRT and the encode, because there's no point in encoding it and then adding an overlay. That's the wrong way around. And then it sat there and marked its own homework. Are there any validation issues? Do you have subscriptions everywhere you would be expecting them? Is the workflow laid out sensibly? Or initially it was all, it clearly wasn't, but it did a much better job as it worked. And so through that process, where you force the LLM to go through sensible steps, you can get to complex workflows really, really quickly. And remember when I was showing the Studio UI earlier, you can then say, well, actually, how do I control this workflow? And it can discover all of that as well. It can go and click on what are the controls, the programmatic controls available for this particular workflow, which means that you can then start to say, actually, change this feature or change that feature, or maybe build me a dashboard as Dom did on a number of occasions, to sit there and allow me to control that in a meaningful way. And so here's the prompt saying, build a dashboard. This is the sort of person who's going to be using it. This is how I want it to happen. And this was its first go at that. It's not perfect, but frankly, it really isn't bad at all. Increasingly, it'll also build those, direct into something like Grafana for you, so that if you've got, that as your operating environment, it should just drag and drop, plug straight in. And we get high quality there by saying, actually, for this particular component, the SRT input, for example, we give the LLM a hint saying, these are the things you're probably going to be interested in. How many different streams are there? Maybe you want some ETRT90 stats. What's the latency coming through? What's the bit rate? What are the packet loss elements and so on? What are my various bit rates, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all things that we can hint to the LLM are something that a user might be interested in. Obviously, you can then tune and tweak that over the course of time. So it's that process of minimizing context all the way through. Discover the useful bits of the UI or the APIs, understanding that you can get Norsk to tell you about things as they happen. And that's the thing that starts to really get interesting, where I'm going to spend the rest of my time. And we don't start from scratch. Say it's, if they're after monitoring or something like this, here's probably where they want to start. This is going to get you 90% of the way there, and maybe there's a bit of tweaking, but you're going to be able to get a much more usable output as a result. So we talked about kind of workflow creation. We've talked about workflow dashboard creation on top of those workflows, and maybe you can get it to change at runtime how things operate and so on, as it was doing when it said, oh, hold on, you need to give me a URL, and then plumbed that in and actually restarted the workflow for me and so on. Where I think things are potentially transformational, or in fact actually transformational, is how I can now get LLMs to look at my live streams and start to manipulate those live streams in really interesting ways. So back to Norsk Studio. So here's another very simple workflow. Or we've got an SRT source coming in. We're sending it to CaptionHub. We are taking the subtitles coming out, CaptionHub, publishing them as low latency HLS and low latency dash, and then we're making sure that the subtitles and the source are synchronized together. That's, we can do a bit better than that, though. We can, let's say, add a reasoning node in. So here we've got, I'm also going to send that content to Norsk reasoning. And let's have we've sort of glossed over the config elsewhere, but let's have a quick look at the config we've got in the Norsk reasoning context. So when you hand something like Norsk reasoning, first of all, what kind of model do I want to be using? And there are basically two classes of model. You've got live models, and so Gemini has a live model, and ChatGPT and AI also have a live model. But you've also got generative models. And if I've got if I'm talking to a generative model, perhaps there's some work I can do in advance. I can feed audio energy levels to that model because that's something that's going to be useful to the AI. How excited is the crowd? How excited is the commentator? Those are all, that's a distillation of that particular piece of information. I can do things like voice activation. How many different people are speaking here? I can say when the scene has changed. Am I now fundamentally sending something different? I can do things like rendering objects and so on out of this. And then I can do 2 phases. I can say, actually, as part of my planning, help me write the right prompt. I can say, this is my intent. Help me build the most effective prompt that's actually going to go and do that. And I can use a particular model here. So here I'm using Gemini 2.5 Pro to help me build my runtime prompt. But actually for the runtime monitoring, I'm using Gemini 3.1. And if I go into live instead, I can bake it various different ways. So in the order of expediency and time, here's what running one of those looks like. So I've started, and you'll see that the prompt I gave it was, I said, I basically want to understand various different events. So let's have a very quick look at this guy again to make it easier. I'm interested in what state the match is in. Is it pre-match? Is it kickoff? Is it first half? Is it second half, et cetera, et cetera. And in particular, I'm probably going to be wanting to use this maybe to do automated ad insertion coming out of the back of that. So the first thing that Norsk Reasoning is doing is it's taking my prompt and it's saying, actually, I'm going to build that into a better prompt. And it took, in this particular case, about 30 seconds to start evaluating that. And it said, yeah, that's grand. And now it's starting to watch the stream that I'm sending to it. And here are some of the early events that it raised from that. It goes, we've got a wide angle shot. The picture is empty. You've got some shots of some spectators who are on their phone, for example. As we scrub a bit further now, you can see that there's kickoff just started in our low latency output. Coming back to here, what we're starting to see here is, so there's an aerial overhead view. If I allow time to progress again, you'll see that it's saying that it's starting to think that kickoff has happened. It's going, I reckon kickoff's happened, but I'm not quite certain yet that that's good enough to actually, do whatever phase change you might want to do as a result. But then after 2 or 3 events of that nature, it's going, yes, I'm more and more confident that it's the kickoff. So I suspect it's kickoff. I still suspect it's kickoff. And a few seconds later, what you'll see is that it goes to the current suspected event is now none, but the last event actually said, yes, this is kickoff. So now the model's saying, I'm actually really quite confident that, this match is now underway. And you can go along, and as it progresses, you'll get, summaries of goals and all sorts of stuff like that. If Steve Strong, the CTO, who was supposed to be giving this, but he's unfortunately on an aeroplane right now, had been giving this demo instead, actually our very, very latest Norsk Reasoning module will even show you the frame of video that triggered that particular reasoning step and so on. So that can get to be, here we've got a close up. You can start to get really quite detailed information as to how you progress through that. And just as with all other things, Norsk, I get to see this and control this. So I can listen on events coming out of that. And there's a whole host of events that Norsk Reasoning is going to generate for me. Responses, events, errors from the LLM, et cetera, et cetera. So I can start to build very sophisticated things out the back of that. And here, that same workflow, we were sending off to CaptionHub. So there's the fantastic CaptionHub X where you get those transcripts and subtitles coming through, and we plumb it all together, and there's the output with the subtitles. And if we go back to, there, you'll see that actually we've also taken the subtitles out of CaptionHub and we're passing them to Norsk Reasoning. That's got really useful information in it. If that were a live model, then you probably wouldn't. You'd just be handing off the audio direct. But here we can start to do very sophisticated things, with staged reasonings that's then generating events that allow us to make meaningful changes. Insert an advert here, tell a grown-up that perhaps, the match is behind schedule, or you might need to delay the news, whatever else it might be. So hopefully that gives you a feel for the kinds of things that one can do with Norsk Reasoning in a live context, and how you can leverage both live and standard or traditional models, I am going to hand back to Tom at this point to tell us about the sort of great context and narrowing that they can do to generate fantastic speech to text and language translation results.
I'm always blown away by what can be achieved with Norsk nowadays. It's very, very cool. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Bridges. I'm the founder and CEO at CaptionHub. And for those of you who don't know CaptionHub, we make a suite of tools to do with multimedia accessibility and localization. And that's true across both VOD and live workflows. And whether that's timed text or burnt in subtitles or synthetic voice, we handle the full gamut. And we use AI a lot in our products, but we also give people the option to have human-in-the-loop workflows as well. I'm going to be talking today about using AI, of course, and what we call natural captions. I'll come on to what natural captions is shortly, but it's how we leverage both of these in a live captioning environment. So I'm not going to talk about any of our VOD capabilities at all, and hopefully there'll be some useful learnings here that won't just be me advertising my company and my product. Let's take a look at two different clips, because some people might be thinking, well, look, AI is great. I'll just plug in Whisper and, we'll get some output, and that's fantastic. And I think a large part of my argument today is explaining, why you can do that, but I'm going to try and argue why you possibly shouldn't do that. So on the left, this is a YouTube clip.
What is the International Space Station? This is the International Space Station. This is an orbiting outpost that is humanity's first permanent home away from home. It was built over the course of a decade by 15 different countries and 5 space agencies. On board, the crew lives in these cylindrical sections. Together, they're about the size of a 5-bedroom house that houses 6 people. This right here is the Canada arm, which is a robotic arm that lives out.
There you go. It's actually not bad. There are some things it gets right, but there are some things it really doesn't get right. And we'll dive into those. Let's have a look at CaptionHub output.
What is the International Space Station? This is the International Space Station. This is an orbiting outpost that is humanity's first permanent home away from home. It was built over the course of a decade by 15 different countries and 5 space agencies. On board, the crew lives in these cylindrical sections. Together, they're about the size of a 5-bedroom house that houses 6 people. This right here is the Canada arm, which is a robotic arm that lives outside.
There we go. Okay, so that's the choice of what you've got. So, on one hand, there's YouTube, which, as I said, hasn't done a terrible job. And on the other hand, you've got the difference. You've got what CaptionHub can do. And on the surface, to the untrained viewer, there might not seem to be very much difference between the two. But I'm going to try and explain why I think there is and why it's worth caring about. So first off, I was just saying it's very easy to create a poor experience with AI. And, the first thing about AI is this webinar is titled Context is King. Without an understanding of context, you will get a lowered accuracy. And that is universally true, no matter what kind of problem you're dealing with and trying to use AI to solve it. The lowered accuracy. So without context, you will get a lowered accuracy. And Adrian pointed that out very, very clearly. And this is an example here. So this is a YouTube caption. This right here is the Canada arm. Now that's what it sounded like to you and me, but the Canada arm actually is all one word. It's a trademark, and the Canada arm is one word. And the CaptionHub transcription managed to get that right. Moving on. One of the really obvious differences between the two is where you get word-by-word transcription. And I'm going to lump in unconsidered segmentation. So word-by-word transcription, that's quite obvious. You've got words flashing on word by word by word. Unconsidered segmentation is when, let's say you've got a character limit and you're just throwing words into a bucket. And so you end up with captions that are technically accurate, but are very, very hard to read. So how we present captions is really, really important. And, here's an example of where YouTube's getting it wrong. This is actually something that's quite hard to read. You've got to have got to commit some effort in order to understand that. And lots of the audience here are in the broadcast industry. What we see a lot, so YouTube, for instance, we're not, there's no awareness of broadcast subtitle formats. So it's wiring in an AI that will come up with a transcript is one thing. Wiring it up to have something that produces intelligible, readable captions that you can then export into different formats, that's another question entirely. As Adrian said, context is king. How can we make our captions more accurate? And the answer is to give it more context. And so there are a variety of different approaches you can use. Custom dictionaries is one of the really key approaches you can make. So custom dictionaries, of course, this is where you're feeding in a list of words, usually proper nouns, so people's names, place names, product names, to bias the AI towards the words in those lists. So it's far more likely that the AI will pick these up and return them correctly. So a football will match footballer's name. Term bases. CaptionHub is a fully multilingual product. Term bases like custom dictionaries, but you're controlling how terms get translated, or in fact, how they don't get translated. You might have a brand that's called, I don't know, something like Amazon at Home. Amazon at Home needs to be Amazon at Home in French. And so we're using term bases, you're telling the AI how to translate something, or how not to translate it, how to preserve the brand styling. Similar to custom dictionaries, again, you can use voiceover dictionaries. We can specify in advance how synthetic voices need to be pronounced. Otherwise, you're sort of veering towards intelligibility, or at least having an intelligibility problem. With modern ASR now, we can store a voice print of a given speaker. So you're not just telling it what someone's saying, you're telling the AI who that person is. And in some cases, that can then affect the translation. So there are some really interesting things we can do with technology now to, giving the AI context that not only affects transcription, but then can affect translation. Substitution dictionaries. This is, I guess, slightly more of a blunt tool, but substitution dictionaries is a live search and replace. So there might be something that is consistently coming out wrong. You can dive in and say, actually, I'd like you to swap out this for this in a live environment. And the last thing that you might want to leverage context is a translation memory. So you can leverage a translation memory. This is how we translated this phrase before. We'd like you to leverage that translation when we're creating our subtitles. All of which leads to dramatically improved accuracy. So there's the accuracy side of the coin. What I want to know about, which might seem less important, but it's something I feel really strongly about, is the presentation side of things. And the fact is this: so word by word transcription increases cognitive load. Why does this matter? Poor captions force viewers to do some decoding instead of being able to understand it. And of course, with a higher cognitive load, you've got more disengagement and lower retention. This is an interesting statistic. So what you're aiming for is to keep people paying attention, but not needing all of their attention. So between 20 or 25% of their attention wants to be focused on the subtitles, but the rest of it wants to be focused on your message. You want your subtitles to be supporting your message, not competing with it. And if you're not doing this right, then you've got people trying to concentrate and getting frustrated on poor quality subtitles and then not paying attention to your message. So the net effect of poorly formatted captions or subtitles is that you won't communicate. And there are a bunch of different studies confirming this. I'm going to flash this up on screen. These are just some of the things that I was able to find. There are many more. And I think it's really, really interesting when you start delving into some of the psychology and neuroscience about how subtitle construction really is key to viewer understanding. So what's the solution? Professional subtitling, of course. And it's true that a human subtitler, given sufficient time, will do an amazing job at being able to balance lots of these competing problems. This is, of course, really, really difficult in a live environment. It's impossible in a live environment. You can't have someone crafting really, really beautiful subtitles. And this is why we developed natural captions. Let me explain what natural captions is. So it's fundamentally what we're trying to do is we're trying to match the levels of output you'd get from a human subtitler. We have codified rules for this into our natural language processing engine. And so we're trying to tell, moving from this transcript to caption format, we're telling the algorithm how to deal with this. And we're paying attention to grammar, we're paying attention to punctuation, we're paying attention to, whether something's a conjunction. We're also paying attention to edits in the footage. And with style guides, we can also, the other side of this is being able to force all of these into a technical standard. So, which is important if your videos are portrait or landscape. It's important if you're trying to hit a broadcast standard, and it's important depending on what language you are. So with CaptionHub, you can specify, per language overrides if you need to, or specify a frame gap. You can go really, really detailed. And there are sometimes tensions between your technical standard and your style guide. And what we do is we iterate and just make sure both requirements are satisfied. And it's a true multilingual solution. So I'm going to skip through these. Same logic applies with translation. So it applies for transcription, but then when we create the translations based off of those transcriptions, we're still applying style guides and the language profiles, the technical specification. So I think all of these are sort of quite self-evident. If you have poor segmentation in the source, that'll compound across translations. If you've got good segmentation, it'll work out well. Timing and reading speed constraints must survive the translation process. And all languages are different. Every language should have its own segmentation. Let's sum up here. There's a huge gap, in my opinion, between having captions and captions really working. And hopefully I've done a little bit to convince you of some of the logic behind that. And this can be because captions are just simply inaccurate because the AI doesn't have sufficient context, or it can be because of the actual structure of the language itself. Good captions should be accurate and context aware. They should follow syntactic phrase boundaries. Adhere to a specification if necessary. As I've said, and there are different types, whether there's a broadcast specification or you've got a video you want to send to TikTok. And you should always take your audience into account for things like reading speed. And it should be available across multiple languages. If you're multilingual, you should be trying to communicate with people in their own language in the best possible way you can. And that's what we're trying to do. I will give you a 30-second demo and then make sure we've got enough time for some questions at the end. So you've already seen a little bit about this with Adrian. I'm going to just hit go. I'm giving CaptionHub a HLS string, and I'm going to hit go on this. So this is just a publicly available HLS string. There we go. What I didn't do was translate it to French and Spanish. We can add these languages on the fly anyway. Setting up the various services we need.
685907 is your item number. They're just one of those pants that you need to put in your cart and try. If you haven't done it already,
and you
make
can see
this
this
maybe
is
your
our
first
caption.
step into the comfy knit air.
Yeah, no, you will fall in love with it like everyone else has. If you watch this from the beginning, Jane was wearing a dress
Yes,
in
the same.
comfy knit air. And we have done so many different things in this fabric because you guys love it.
Pause that. You are getting nicely formatted captions. These are being processed captions in real time with Caption. So that's it from me. There's a brief moment to take some questions from the audience. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tom. We do have a couple minutes for questions, and we have a few questions from the audience. I'd like to start off with, and maybe Adrian, you can answer this. In your examples, is the AI running on the server, or does it get sent up to the cloud? Curious on how to keep costs down when having an AI constantly look at everything.
That's a great question. And the answer is it's a mix. And I think our initial focus with AI for sort of live stream managing was using the live AIs, so the Gemini Lives and the ChatGPT Live and so on. And there you're pushing up multiple frames a second, probably something like 5 frames a second, and all the audio. And in the responses that I showed in some of the demos, we're actually displaying token count going up and token count coming down and so on. And you do need to be careful. It does add up as a sort of rule of thumb. I think the sort of $5 to $10 an hour range is where something like Gemini, depends on the model you use and so on, is going to end up. But again, yeah, it comes back to context is king. Instead of sending all of that information, instead of sending the audio, maybe I can just send the captions. That's much, much smaller. If I've doing those anyway because I want fantastic captions in my output, don't send the audio, send the captions, unless there's important information in the unless I'm trying to do something based on the tone or the intonation. How excited is the commentator, etc. So another nice example where you might have a hybrid is, again, in something like captioning, we'll sometimes run a local OCR LLM locally. So we're looking at the stream that we're producing, and does it have, for example, a rolling third? Because one of the worst things you can possibly do with captions is have the captions put directly on top of scrolling text behind. It makes it almost impossible to read. And so the kinds of things you can do there is say, actually, I'm going to run a local model to find out where a good place to put the captions is, and then we'll move them up the screen or down the screen, depending on what happens. So there you might be using CaptionHub for doing the actual speech to text, but we're running this different model locally to then work out where we're going to choose to render those captions. So yeah, both is the right answer. And again, that's one of the reasons you might use traditional, if that even makes sense in an AI context, LLMs, where you're sending an image every 10 seconds. Is that going to be good enough? And it's certainly going to save you money in terms of token usage and so on.
Tom, some of the problems you mentioned with AI generated captions, why can't they be fixed with just a better AI model? And, is automated speech recognition to the point now where it's good enough?
You're muted,
Tom.
I'm not doing very well with the technology nowadays. I do apologize. Hopefully I've demonstrated why just having something that's producing words can fall down. It's what we've been doing is we've been sort of trying to codify some rules to make the output as strong as possible. It's really hard, at least we haven't managed to do it, to actually put AI in the middle of a transcript and captions. And I think there are actually lots of reasons why it's better to codify those rules and make it algorithmic rather than just make it pure LLM based. I think there's a tendency nowadays to think we've got the sledgehammer, which is AI, and look at every single problem out there as being a nut. And I think in this particular case, it's better to have full control over what's going on and make sure that the system's behaving exactly as you want it to. I think that determinism is a good thing in this case.
Makes sense. You mentioned that sometimes we think of AI, as the hammer and see everything as a nut. Dom, I'm wondering what your thoughts on how to determine when AI is the right tool and when it's the wrong tool for solving a problem.
Oh, I'm just going to cop out there. And energy efficiency. It's a really good start to experiment with my grinning string out. And I think you've got to, somebody said earlier on today, it's a fast moving field. It changes direction every day. So as soon as you can sort of put a ring fence around one capability being complementary to AI and another being something that the AI creates for itself, or so the sooner that boundary moves. But I think arriving with an enormous amount of the capability focused on the area that you're trying to solve problems and extending that intelligence by using AI. I prefer extended intelligence to artificial intelligence as an expression. And I think that using it to just extend that last mile to explore things at this stage is the right thing to be doing. If you jump in too fast, I'm worried that we're going to be trying to build castles out of jelly. And that concerns me. But then at the same time, we've got to embrace it. And the great thing is the place to experiment with it is in the edge cases, which is what's fun.
I think I'd echo exactly that. I think one of the things that generalized AIs, the LLMs and so on of the world, allow you to do is to experiment in a project to experiment around a particular use case becomes a prompt engineering exercise over the course of a few hours or a few days. Whereas historically, it might have been an engineering exercise over the course of a few months to get the same result. At the end of the day, it might well be that the final solution uses kind of more traditional methods, but it does certainly allow you to explore new spaces very quickly.
I think of the sort of three models that I or 3 or 4 models that I showed. A lot of attention is always drawn to the last one because it's got an ROI. You can insert adverts. That's exciting. But actually, the one that's most likely to sort of emerge in production is going to be the MCR Extra Eyes model. It's just simply doing something which is difficult, from one cognitive overload if you don't have that assistance. And AI is actually pretty good over a few minutes at going, I think I'm seeing something wrong. I'm going to raise an exception. Excellent use case. Bet your farm on it as a money maker, as your remote producer.
I think that's a great example as well of something like that. Monitoring, we for some of our live event customers, they had teams where they would literally have one event in one language going on in one ear for somebody monitoring it, and the language in a different event in the other ear. And they had to have sort of enforced breaks every 90 minutes because frankly your head explodes in that kind of environment. And actually what we managed to boil down to there is you could do that sort of thing with AI. Is it the right language? Is it the right event? Is it on the right subject? I don't want to take a T-Mobile thing and send it to a Premier League event or something. But at the same time, actually what were they listening for? They were listening for silence. They were listening for tea break gaps and so on and so forth. And actually we managed to implement sort of 95% of it just using traditional processes, at which point you suddenly don't have all of the token costs and so on. So, great technology to experiment in there as you make it robust and predictable and repeatable. It paves the way, but it may not be there at the end. I think increasingly it will be there at the end, just for the record. But
Tom, anything to add as sort of a last word?
I've been nodding along because I think both Dom and Adrian have been making really fantastic points. It's a really exciting time to be in this sector right now. And we are seeing so much possibility. And we're seeing possibility in terms of what the tools can do and, also what, the teams behind, the creation of those tools are able to achieve. It's really phenomenal. But I think the role for humans is still very, very present. I think the most power we're going to get, certainly in the short to medium term, is where AI is assistive and is helping people do their jobs. That's certainly a philosophy we try and embrace. If there's a tool out there that is worth doing because it's making someone's easier, then we'll embrace it. If it's just for show, then there's more consideration around it. But it's a really fascinating time to be here, at this particular intersection, media technology and AI. It's super, super interesting to be.
That's a great place to end it on. We will send out an email when this webinar is available for on-demand viewing. Thanks, Tom, Adrian, and Dom, and thanks to our audience for your questions. And that wraps things up.
Thank you.
cheers, folks. Thank you.